Welcome along, everybody. We'll just give those who are slight stragglers 1 extra minute, and then we'll get straight into it. Thanks for joining us today. So we are talking today about two things neatly amalgamated into one thing. The first is with my guest, Christy from Agnition, who's going
Hey
to be talking
everyone.
to us about Agnition in general and the pilot farm network specifically. And in the context of that, we're going to be talking about how we, CarbonCrop, use the pilot farm network to help test some of the new innovations for landholder engagement with our platform and with their forests and with people supporting them in connection with their forests, which is sort of following on from the stuff that we shared last week. So yes, Christy Mead is an ag tech growth specialist from Agnition Ventures. I'll be handing over to her to sort of give you a full spiel about 5 minutes in, and I'll stop talking for a bit, and then we'll get into the details of the sort of results that we got from the pilot farm network and how we expect those to be applied as our product evolves. As usual, any questions that come in, drop them in the Q&A panel. Hopefully I don't completely crash the webinar later on trying to find out where that's gone, because honestly, I'm having a day of it with Zoom at the moment, but we've also got a whole bunch of questions that came in advance, so we can have a look at those too. So for those of you who joined last month's webinar, this will be a very familiar slide. The reason that I'm sharing it again is that the evolution that was sort of outlined here from sort of our beginnings as a company of mostly being an internally technology-enabled forest consultancy service to then making the portal available to our customers, to then making a platform available to larger customers, to then making a multi-stakeholder platform available to groups of customers. You'll see on the left-hand side of this final little picture here, there's all of the little happy farmers in their overalls with their trees. These like landholders are a key stakeholder in this whole process. It's like ultimately your land that's going to have some forest on it and be registered in a scheme or not. And so the key thing we were looking to test was how are our tools for landholders to engage with directly rather than for a full-time forestry consultant to use them. And that's what we were looking to use the pilot farm network for. The sort of background to this was, and this was actually a more recent comment, but the idea that we had was that a lot of the stuff that happens on a farm is a lot of the stuff that happens on the farm in connection to the recognition of forest on that farm for carbon is things that farmers are well positioned to actually deal with. And this is a comment I got about 2 months ago from not a customer, just someone I was talking to this about idly, before I'd mentioned that we're making this product available. And they said, I'm not stupid, and I feel like I could do most of this stuff. I just need the right tools and some hints. And I was like, well, funny you should say that, because we very much share that view. So I'd say even more than that, our view isn't just that farmers would be able to do a lot of these things that we're talking about here in terms of the sort of forestry recognition process, but you're also the best people to do a lot of these things, better than a consultant, because when it comes to something like what's the history of this area, or what do we do on the farm last year, or what do we plan to do next year, and is this scheme right for us? A lot of that is context that if like CarbonCrop, for example, was to come in and start talking to you about it, we have to ask all of these questions. We don't have the history, and we have to like build up a model of what's right for you and your property. And you'd already know all of that. However, there are a bunch of obstacles to a landholder just going away and doing all of this themselves, which is due to the complexity of the frameworks and the systems. And we routinely find people asking questions like, do I actually have anything? Am I on the right track with the process? Am I going down the wrong path? Have I missed something critical? Is this all going to go horribly wrong? And so the sort of the key question that we got to was like, I just need the right tools and some hints. Like, how far are we off having those right tools and the appropriate hints at the right point? So is this something that we actually can better empower landholders to do a sort of like supported do-it-yourself kind of approach, or is it still too big a gap? So it was with that sort of question in our minds and the state that our tools were at that point that we got involved with the pilot farm network. As disclosure, like Ravensdown is an investor in CarbonCrop by way of Agnition, which I'll leave Christy to talk about more. But so there was sort of we already had a relationship where we got involved, but it was also a very compelling fit for us that it would clearly help us reach a certain demographic to help us ask this question. And so with that, I'll hand over to Christy to tell you a little bit more about what Agnition is and how it fits in with Ravensdown. Christy.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I suppose just for like a little bit of context on me and my role. So I have worked with Ravensdown for around 7 years now. I spent the first 6 or so of those on the road as an agri manager, so out there talking to farmers on the east coast of New Zealand every day. From there, I started with Agnition a little over a year ago, and in my sort of ag tech growth specialist role. So this is one of the parts of my role that I do, which is the Part Farm Network, something I'm particularly passionate about. We live on a sheep and beef farm in Hawke's Bay that my husband manages, so very much kind of in touch with the day-to-day there and help out where I can outside of work as well. So a bit of context on who's kind of speaking to you on this Part Farm Network stuff. But to give a bit of a bigger picture, so I would assume that pretty much everyone here has heard of Ravensdown. We essentially have around 50% of the New Zealand farmers buying their fertilizer and other farm inputs from Ravensdown directly. And what Agnition is essentially the commercial sort of innovation arm of Ravensdown. So we still sort of function with that same sort of vision in mind, which is that smarter farming for a better New Zealand. But instead of focusing on that core business around nutrients and essential inputs and really the right products and the science and things like that, we're sort of looking a little bit more into the future on what sort of opportunities are out there that could potentially solve some real world challenges on our farmers and shareholders' farms. So to give a bit of context on what sort of sits under Agnition's umbrella, if you will. Next slide, please, Nick. We'll 100% owned by Ravensdown. It functions with its own board and CEO. And then I'm one of the sort of 7 of us that are in the core team. We sort of have 3 key parts to our business. So there's the scale function, which is where some of Ravensdown's existing portfolio businesses or historical portfolio businesses fit in. Things like the ARL laboratory, where our soil testing and water testing and plant testing gets done. We also have some shares in Seedax, CropMark Seeds, and Southstar Technologies, which are a fertilizer coating plant or a product coating plant here in Christchurch. So there's those kind of businesses which are already existing, and it's really looking about how we can scale or take those into the future. We look at some things that are kind of new businesses or science that's been done and how that can be taken into the future. So an example of that is sort of EcoPond. We've a recent collaboration with Armour. And there's a bunch of other things that we have sort of work in the background around what could we start or partner with to start at that really sort of incubator stage to look at some of those problems in the future. And we also invest in early stage promising ag tech companies. So that's where CarbonCrop kind of comes into the mix. So we're also always on the lookout for companies that are functioning in a space that we think can provide genuine value to our shareholders, but also sort of fitting with that smarter farming for a better New Zealand kind of overarching brand. One of my parts of the role is I sort of function across, a lot of those with the Pilot Farm Network. So that kind of fits in a few different places. So with that, we sort of leave Ravensdown to do the core fertilizer, agrochemicals, seed in collaboration with CropMark. But we sort of function in that adjacency sort of space. So either things that are kind of near to that in the nutrient space, but also looking a little bit further into what other opportunities are out there that maybe can have some real tangible change for our industry. So things that might be around sort of analytics or, robotics or drones or, looking into even opportunities in sort of tourism or finance and how that can kind of all feed back into our sort of core customer and what they value. So I suppose this is where it kind of comes into our portfolio companies. So we have these are our current ones. This is completely up to date. So these companies fit in one shape or form into that kind of rainbow of context. So just to kind of take you through just ever so briefly the range that we have here. So we have AIMA, which essentially is around pasture management, improving productivity, utilizing AI. CarbonCrop, which we're all here for today. We also have more recently invested in IF, which is actually founded in Australia, and that's around looking at essentially for consumers, people in towns, to invest in a farmer's produce in a really sort of fun app kind of manner, a little bit like Sharesies. Leaf is looking at protein and protein extraction from green leaves. So where that kind of fits with farmers is, our farmers have the ability to grow that product, and Leaf has essentially a new market for it. So what they're using at the moment there, I believe, is lucerne, is kind of what they've got their baseline on, but looking to expand further. Kiwi Fibre, early stage New Zealand company, got put up in lights a wee bit at the field days more recently. So they're using harakeke or flax to create a really strong fibre that can then be utilised for other products. And then very, very new to the portfolio is Pest Technologies, and that's around looking at soil health and soil measurement in field. So testing in field, getting results, to your phone within minutes, both, sort of physical, chemical, and obviously biological type soil data. So that's kind of the range of companies that we have invested in this far, and they all kind of fit one way or another into our sort of greater mission, as sort of spoken about earlier. So the pilot farm network sort of fits across a lot of what we do. It was created really to get some of these innovations, either new innovative companies with cool products or existing companies that have something new to come to the market, and getting it on real farm quicker. So that's really our goal. And what we found was there's, a lot of farmers, they're busy. They're keen and curious to see what's coming up in the future, but don't necessarily have the time nor want to muck about with sort of technologies that don't actually suit their system or their goals. And on the other hand, a lot of our innovators or companies that we speak with, some of which we invest in, a lot of which we don't, they have a product but are really looking to get that bit of feedback or sort of refinement from the farmers directly, and this is a way for them to access some of their markets. So it's very much a two-way street, and it's really about connecting real innovations with real farmers to accelerate that part of our sector. So for a bit of context around what we've had in our pilot farm network this far. So in the past, it's been going for a little over a year. So this side here is our first 2 webinars. So over our first 2 webinars, we had 8 innovations. We now have them out on just over 60, I think it's about 63 pilots that are active on farms or have been completed since then. These are the range of companies that we've showcased through our pilot farm network thus far. So you can see there's a bit of a range. There's some, like you can see, that we've invested in that are our portfolio companies. So like Cropmark Seeds, one of the originals, and Aimer and CarbonCrop and If, which are much newer. And then other companies that are doing really cool stuff out there in the market. So each of these come to us or bring to the pilot farm network a pilot or an offer for our farmers to engage with. And then we bring everyone into the room in a webinar format. And it's probably a little bit different in the sense it's a bit of a Shark Tank, Dragon's Den type style, where our innovators all have sort of around 10 minutes or so to pitch their pilot and showcase what it is they're doing and what they might want to get out of engaging with the farmer to trial this on their farm. And our farmers can listen and then sign up or select a pilot that suits them and their business and their goals. And it really sort of reduces the risk, I think, for both parties. So there's some pretty cool stuff out there. We've had, everything from pasture measurement to soil sensors. We've had wool pole protectors. We've got software. We've got hardware. We've got a little bit of everything. And it's been really cool to see the engagement from our farmers throughout these first 2 webinars and be able to get, that much more innovation out in, 60 farms, 60 pilots across New Zealand. So it's just for a little bit of context that gives a flair for what we've had so far. What we've actually got live currently is just four pilots that were launched in the spring. So these ones have just been launched in our most recent webinar and are currently available, for farmers to sign up to if they're interested. AIM has come back for a second round with their Vision app, so a new development for their product. So existing company now, but new product that they're quite keen to share. Market Drench Gun is actually owned and created by a young farmer. She's only 19, and she actually won the Young Innovator of the Year award at the field days this year. So really cool to be able to showcase a young innovator that's got something really cool coming through from that sort of a perspective. Bitwise is an Australian company, New Zealand girl, but Australian company, looking at berries and forecasting yield to get, really very, very accurate forecasts and yield predictions. And then Drone Hand, another Australian company looking to expand into New Zealand, where they essentially have a drone, the farmer's own drone flown on their own property, whereby they can count livestock live and also check animal health. So it'll look at if you've got a down cow or a cast ewe, it'll be able to identify that live as the drone scoots out. So big time saver, particularly for our sheep and beef guys in that one. So those ones are live at the moment on our website, but they sort of complete our first just over 12 months of the pilot farm network, and what we've got, had come through the pipeline. So pretty cool stuff, I think. And Nick obviously has been part of it from the very first one, and can tell us a little bit more.
Cheers, Christy. That's excellent. So if you do have particular questions around that, I think there's a way we can go to the Pilot Farm Network website. I'm sure you'll find a way to Christy's contact details in some form or another fairly quickly then, but also throw questions in the Q&A if you want Christy to answer something while we've got her here today. So our objective going into the Pilot Farm Network was basically, I think firstly, we're interested in the experience of using the Pilot Farm Network as an outreach mechanism and a farmer engagement mechanism, but also we had a fairly clear question in our mind, which it was a nice kind of platform to test, which was, how useful will our sort of updated digital platform be for farmers under a sort of supported DIY ETS registration process? We were a bit skeptical that it would be something where we could just throw it up on a website and anybody could use it without any expertise whatsoever, because there's a huge amount of it which requires still quite a lot of expertise. But we also were quite confident that people could do a lot themselves without us having to sort of do literally every single part of it for them. So that was the test, was where in that spectrum was the result actually going to fall. As Christy mentioned, we had 8 inquiries from, I'm not sure what the actual audience size was in those first sessions, Christy, but it was like a fairly high interest rate, on the order of sort of 30%-ish of those we presented to, I think, expressed some interest. Do you know the numbers, Kirsty? Sorry?
In the webinar itself, we had around 80 participants come through. Half of the participants in the webinar signed up for a pilot. And then of the CarbonCrop ones, or those that registered their interest in CarbonCrop, I think, around sort of 50 or 60% of them carried on through.
Okay, all right, 10% then rather than 30%. My numbers were a bit too optimistic, but there was still quite high for something where it's just someone turning up to a webinar and maybe being interested in some stuff that's on show. And what was also interested was, across that portfolio, how much we identified in terms of stuff that was of value and the value wasn't currently being captured or recognized. So we analyzed 3,100 hectares of land across those, I think it was 8 farms, or I'm not sure if that was the 5 farms that progressed to the later stages. Of that, 1,200 hectares was forest. A big chunk of it was already registered in the ETS. So that was like, they already knew that they had forest, and it was more just validation of what else was there and checking out the modeling tooling. But there was also a lot of forest that wasn't yet registered in the ETS. And so that block of forest, which was split across, I think, 3 or 4 farms, was sequestering $300,000 worth of carbon a year that wasn't currently being claimed. And then there was another 250 odd hectares of forest, which wasn't eligible for the ETS, but was potentially eligible for inclusion for sort of in supply chain inset applications, which we can also support. Of those 200 hectares that were eligible for the ETS, one of those farms has now completed the entire process right through to ETS application for registration submission. I think they're now waiting on the results to come through, but it allowed us to prove out quite well that, yes, this was something where somebody who's engaged in the process and motivated and is willing to invest a moderate amount of time can do a lot of it themselves. And I mean, I've been at pains to emphasize as well, we don't necessarily view this as primarily a cost-saving thing. Like, you probably will save some money, but forestry consultants are really good at their jobs generally, and they're quite efficient. They use these tools all the time. I think much more important than that, and you may well still be working with a forestry consultant in various capacities. A huge part of the benefit, though, is the insight that you gain through the process and the extent to which you build intuition about this sort of general carbon forestry area of activity, which up until now, I think a lot of farmers have sort of treated as this sort of off to the side thing that's a little bit black magic, and it's like, works in this weird regulated market and it might not be entirely clear what the obligations are and the opportunities are, et cetera, et cetera. If you can actually get your hands on the tools yourself and start trying out some options, then you start to sort of demystify it and therefore be in a much better position to assess the opportunities that might be available in the context of what you want to do and how you want to do it. And the way you do that, I'm definitely not going to go through all of the functionality today, and I'm not even actually going to load up the full portal as I did in the last webinar. Go back and have a look if you wanted a slightly closer spoiler, partly because I think it makes everybody seasick when I start zooming around all the camera angles. But we now have a lot of the core tasks and workflows sort of built into the application, and there's sort of step-by-steps through the app of, in order to do this, you first have to do this, and then you have to do this, and then you have to add these maps here, and then you have to assess this. And like, if you just view it as a big, complicated, get your forest into the ETS, or figure out what forest you have that's eligible, and then if you have any, get it into the ETS, it's a little bit hard to approach and quite daunting if you don't have expertise in the domain. But if you break it out into all of the little individual tasks that have to be accomplished, most of them are totally manageable for somebody who doesn't necessarily have a lot of background in the space, but is sort of standard level conversant with computers and mapping tools and is happy to spend a bit of time working with it. So here's just a couple of very quick screenshots. Like, a question that might be asked is my regenerating forest eligible? So these forest boundaries here have been drawn in automatically by the tools. That's one of the things you get when you sort of click into the application. And we've got access to all of the relevant aerial imagery for your farm. You don't have to go looking for it. You don't have to figure out how to load it into a GIS application. It's already there. And you can look at it and go, oh, yep, I see if I go back to 1990, some of these areas, they're reasonably well vegetated. They're probably not going to fly, but quite a bit of it is actually very lightly vegetated. I probably can register that in the ETS. The next question you generally ask yourself is, why would I bother? In fact, you might have even asked yourself that beforehand. What might it return? And so we can immediately show you the potential yield for that area of forest. And now you're not talking about an ETS registration, which is a little bit of a nebulous and ephemeral thing. You're talking about $5,000 per year for this area highlighted in yellow over the next 10 years or so. And then you can start to trade that off against what other things you might be spending your time on, what other things you might be doing with that land, whether you're happy to accept the restrictions. What's the actual process for registering it now that you've decided you wanted to? So there's two key parts. Firstly, you need the correct accounts, and then secondly, you need to go through the registration process. We've got this as an MPI evidence report tool, which takes you through a whole. So there's a couple of things going on here. Firstly, you've marked the areas that you're interested in registering, and from then the tool just starts throwing these prompts at you saying, you still need to add this. You just need to put this little bit of information in there. This geometry is not quite right. And it means that you go from a fairly big, complicated set of unknowns into a checklist of just add your ETR account number, add the establishment method for this forest, add the land status in 1989 for this forest here. And it's surprisingly quick. Like I could probably finish the registration for this bit of land in the next 15 minutes. And possibly we'll actually do one like that at some point in the future, just to kind of properly take the complexity away, but we're already going to run out of time, so I won't do that right now. Another, I'd say almost the most valuable area is exploring new plantings, which might not be visible from aerial imagery and where it's only that you've got the local farm knowledge of the fact that you recently put some trees in there to know that it happened at all. Or perhaps even more so, areas that you haven't planted yet, but you're thinking about it and you want to sort of play around and explore some options. Like, what if I planted that hill up there that's constantly, every time it rains, I'm worried I'm going to have a landslide. I'm thinking of retiring it. I don't know what the economics would be. Which species should I pick? It's very quick and easy to test that out and try some scenarios. In the same way that you might consider changing a stocking mix on a particular area, or even the stock you're running, you can sort of have a look at this option of what if I put that into trees? We are framing all of this as supported DIY. I think, maybe the nirvana eventually is full DIY, but I think there's enough questions that tend to come up through the process, especially our experience with the Pilot Farm Network, that this isn't something where we're saying, don't you worry, one click, everything will be taken care of for you and be able to run it all yourself. Like, there is a lot of support that's valuable at various key points during the process around assessing eligibility, and then just sort of a sanity check, almost more for comfort and confidence than anything else pre-submission. And then once you're registered, we think that our tools offer a lot of value for ongoing management of sort of forecasting and compliance assurance, but you don't have to use them. And at this stage, we're planning on primarily making this available with the support functions through the catchment groups that we're starting to work with, because they're in this sort of really natural, aligned group that tends not to be a purely commercially focused entity, tends to have the interests of the members of the catchment at heart and be looking to help them achieve the best outcomes for their land. And they're also already engaged in these various activities of helping with biodiversity support and forest restoration and protection and erosion control, which tends to be pretty well aligned with reasons that farmers that we've spoken to are interested in getting forest into the ETS as well. I should add, this isn't a completely exclusive launch channel. We are working with a number of land use advisors and forestry consultants as well, who are also an excellent channel for this kind of thing, but the catchment groups are kind of the new one. So these key steps under this model will be heavily supported by the catchment group coordinators for those groups where we're participating. We're also involved in the process as well, and the key is that we think that the tooling that we have makes it a lot easier than it would be to do it under sort of legacy delivery system models. So as I mentioned before, there's really three benefits that I want to highlight that I think you get by being directly involved rather than sort of somewhat more hands-off. Firstly, it demystifies the whole thing. Like, there's nothing like playing around with it a little bit to properly understand it. And we are seeing this in many of our discussions as an emerging key revenue stream for a lot of hill country farms. And I imagine if you talk to hill country farmers who do have forest in the ETS, they'll be telling you the same thing at the moment. We certainly saw a lot of carbon sold in the last 18 months when commodity prices and other sectors were down a little bit. And it's a sort of a relatively decoupled source of cash flow to smooth out when other stuff's looking a bit murkier. It also helps you build intuition around your current and future opportunities. And this is something which I think is really hard to outsource to anybody else, because anything that you could do on your farm in the future is sort of whirling around in your head when you're having a coffee or having a shower or trying to go to sleep at night. It's very hard for somebody else to do that kind of balancing of options and thinking through possibilities for you versus you kind of weighing up, well, I have been thinking about putting a new fence in there after all. If I was to put that fence in at the same time as I did the planting, and the planting was going to be this species and it was going to have that future yield and it would cost me this much up front, it's kind of following those little threads that's difficult to do if you don't have an intuition for it. But if you can build an intuition with tools, it becomes actually almost do it without thinking in the same way that you do for many other on-farm practices. And the final benefit is that this is very much as and when it suits you to engage. Like, you're not at the mercy of anybody else's schedule. If you've got some time that you want to explore something, it's very cost effective to do it in little bits. If you just want to register 3 hectares, it's very cheap to just register 3 hectares in multiple senses. You don't have the sort of fixed overhead of having to engage a third-party professional in the way that, like, if you're planning on building a massive new fence, you might hire a fencer. But if you just want one fence post re-nailed, you're probably not going to hire a professional fencer to come in and do it for you. It's good to be able to do the little bits and pieces yourself. That's my spiel. If you'd like to try this, best way to get started at the moment is to contact your catchment group or catchment collective coordinators and have them get in touch with us, or just contact us directly yourself at hello@carboncrop.com. And with that, I guess we can call it a session. Thanks so much, Christy, for joining and for giving us an introduction to all that Agnition are doing. We've certainly appreciated being part of your under the umbrella. And yeah, being part of the Pilot Farm Network was really helpful. So I encourage anybody listening who's got an innovation to get in touch with Christy and finding out how they can be part of it.
Thank you very much for having me. Much appreciated.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your days.